The gavel cracked against the mahogany-sounding block with gunshot suddenness, echoing violently through the stifling air of Courtroom 302. Judge Victor Langford sneered down from his elevated bench, his eyes filled with absolute contempt, as he ordered a struggling black woman to be silenced and removed by armed bailiffs. He believed she was just another helpless face caught in his system, another case file to be stamped, dismissed, and destroyed. He thought he possessed absolute, untouchable power. What he did not know was that the woman he was trying to silence held the one document that would dismantle his entire life. In moments, his career would be annihilated. Within days, he would be facing a federal indictment. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County Circuit Court shut out the chaotic noise of downtown Chicago. But inside Courtroom 302, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioning had been broken for days, leaving the crowded gallery sweating under the flickering fluorescent lights. Yet the heat in the room was not merely physical, it radiated from the oppressive, unmistakable stench of a rigged game. Maya Thompson stood at the defendant's table, her spine rigid, her knuckles white, as she gripped the edges of a massive three-ring binder. Maya was a junior financial analyst in her mid-30s, a woman accustomed to finding the hidden truth in endless rows of numbers. She was not a lawyer, but necessity had forced her into the role of a pro se litigant. She was fighting to save her family's legacy, a sprawling, historic brownstone in Bronzeville that had been owned by her late grandfather Arthur Thompson since 1968. Across the aisle sat opposing counsel, attorney Preston Hale. Hale was a corporate shark in a tailored suit representing a shadowy real estate conglomerate known as Apex Holdings. Apex had appeared shortly after her grandfather's passing, presenting a predatory forged lien against the property. They claimed Arthur had taken out a massive high-interest collateral loan in his final dementia-riddled days. It was a blatant land grab, a legal fiction designed to steal generational wealth. But the real obstacle was not Hale. It was the man sitting high above them all, draped in black silk. Judge Victor Langford was a fixture in the local judicial circuit, known equally for his silver-haired, patrician good looks and his notorious lack of patience for pro se defendants. He had a reputation for being tough on contract disputes, which was an open-court euphemism for consistently ruling in favor of deep-pocketed corporate developers. Judge Langford peered down at Maya over the rim of his reading glasses, his expression one of bored irritation. He had already checked his gold Rolex twice in the last 10 minutes. "Miss Thompson," Judge Langford sighed, his voice dripping with condescension, "this court has indulged your amateur theatrics for the better part of an hour. You have failed to demonstrate any legal basis to dismiss the plaintiff's motion for immediate eviction and asset seizure. I am prepared to rule." "Your Honor," Maya said, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins, "if you would just look at Exhibit D. The forensic accounting report clearly shows that the signatures on the loan origination documents do not match my grandfather's handwriting. Furthermore, the notary stamp "Objection, Your Honor," Hale drawled, barely looking up from his legal pad. "Relevance. Furthermore, Ms. Thompson is attempting to introduce expert testimony without having appropriately vetted or scheduled an expert witness according to the Illinois Rules of Civil Procedure." "Sustained," Langford snapped instantly, striking his gavel lightly. "The document is stricken from the record." "Miss Thompson, you cannot simply wave pieces of paper around and expect the court to accept them as gospel." "It is a certified forensic document, Your Honor," Maya pushed back, taking a half step forward. "The notary whose seal is on the loan agreement, a Mr. Thomas Gregson, lost his license years earlier for fraud. The loan is dated 2023. This is a fabricated document." "Objection, speculation, and hearsay," Hale interrupted smoothly. "Sustained," Langford echoed, his voice rising. "Miss Thompson, I will not warn you again. You are out of line, and you are grossly out of your depth. You do not know the law, and I will not allow you to waste the taxpayers' time or this court's time." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Maya felt the eyes of the public pressing into her back. She looked at Hale, who offered a fleeting, microscopic smirk of triumph. She looked up at Langford. The judge's face was a mask of cold authority. an impenetrable wall of systemic power. He was not listening to the facts, he was actively burying them. Maya looked down at her binder. For months, she had spent sleepless nights tracing the labyrinthine corporate structure of Apex Holdings. It was a ghost company, a Russian nesting doll of LLCs registered in Delaware, entirely insulated from public scrutiny. But Maya was an analyst. She knew that money always leaves a trail, no matter how deeply it is buried. Digging through property tax records, offshore routing numbers, and obscure municipal filings, she had found the thread and pulled it. What she discovered at the end of that thread was so monumental, so deeply corrupt, that she had barely believed it herself. She had brought the evidence to court that day, hoping to submit it quietly, hoping the justice system would correct itself once the truth was presented. But as she stared at Judge Langford's smug, imperious face, she realized the terrifying truth. He was not ignoring the evidence because he was biased. He was suppressing it because he was protecting himself. "Your Honor," Maya said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of deferential pleading, "I respectfully request that you recuse yourself from this case immediately." The courtroom went dead silent. The heavy breathing of the broken HVAC unit seemed to echo in the sudden void. Hale's pen froze on his legal pad. Judge Langford's head snapped up, his jaw tightening as a flash of genuine anger replaced his bored facade. "Excuse me?" Langford's voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. "I am filing an oral motion for your immediate recusal, Judge Langford," Maya stated, locking her dark eyes with his. "You have a direct, undisclosed conflict of interest in this litigation." Langford leaned forward, resting his forearms on the bench. The arrogance radiated off him in waves. "Miss Thompson, you are treading on incredibly thin ice. I suggest you pack up your little binder and step back from the podium before I hold you in contempt." "I have a right to place my motion on the record." Maya stood her ground. "You have the right to remain silent," Langford barked, his face flushing red. "I am silencing you, Miss Thompson. One more word, and I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" The threat hung heavy in the room. To the left of the bench, Deputy Officer Terrence Holt, a burly bailiff with a hand resting near his duty belt, shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on Maya. Holly stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "Your Honor, in light of the defendant's hostile and erratic behavior, I ask that the court grant the summary judgment immediately. My client, Apex Holdings, has suffered enough delays." "Granted," Langford said swiftly, raising his gavel. "Apex Holdings is a shell corporation," Maya shouted, her voice ringing out, refusing to be buried by the heavy wood of the gavel. Crack! The gavel struck the block with violent force. "Bailiff!" Langford roared, spit flying from his lips. "Take this woman into custody. I am holding her in criminal contempt of court." Deputy Holt moved swiftly, his heavy boots thudding against the carpeted floor as he approached Maya from behind. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back," the officer commanded, reaching for her wrist. The gallery erupted into frantic whispers. Maya did not fight the bailiff, but she did not surrender her voice. She twisted slightly, just enough to face the court reporter, a young woman whose fingers were frozen over her stenography machine. "Get this on the record," Maya commanded with terrifying authority, ignoring the heavy grip of the bailiff on her arm. "Apex Holdings is a subsidiary of a Delaware entity called Vanguard Capital LLC." "Shut her up!" Langford screamed, half standing behind his bench, his judicial composure entirely shattered. "Gag her if you have to, officer. Remove her from my courtroom." "Vanguard Capital," Maya continued, her voice projecting to the back row of the gallery, "is funded entirely by an offshore trust registered in the Cayman Islands under the name the Langford Family Heritage Trust." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking the oxygen out of courtroom 302. The bailiff, who was in the process of pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt, suddenly froze. He looked from Maya to the court reporter and finally up to the judge. Attorney Hale's face drained of all color. He sank slowly back into his leather chair, as if all the bones in his legs had evaporated. Judge Victor Langford stood paralyzed. The flush of rage on his cheeks instantly turned to an ashen, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "Account number 8849021-1B," Maya rattled off, her eyes blazing as she stared the judge down. Routing through the Grand Cayman branch of the First Atlantic Bank. That trust receives monthly dividend payments directly from the eviction settlements and property liquidations executed by Apex Holdings. You are not just ruling on behalf of the plaintiff, Judge Langford. You are the plaintiff. You have been using your own courtroom to illegally seize property, evict working-class families, and funnel the stolen equity directly into your own private offshore bank accounts. That is a lie, Langford finally stammered, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. It was shrill, desperate. That is a defamatory, psychotic lie. Bailiff, I gave you an order. Arrest her. But Deputy Holt slowly let go of Maya's arm. The officer took a step back. The implications of what had just been stated on a public open court record were catastrophic. If a fraction of it were true, the man sitting on the bench was guilty of massive federal crimes, including wire fraud, judicial corruption, and racketeering. Maya reached into her binder, pulling out a thick stack of stapled papers. These are the SWIFT transfer receipts, Your Honor, she said, her voice dripping with ice. They detail over $4 million moved from Apex real estate liquidations directly into your personal trust over the previous several years, including the $300,000 you projected to make off stealing my grandfather's home. She tossed the documents onto the defense table. They hit the wood with a heavy, satisfying slap. I have already forwarded physical copies of this entire binder to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit, the Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board, and the Investigative Journalism Desk at the Chicago Tribune, Maya said. They received them earlier that morning. Langford collapsed back into his high-backed leather chair. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. His hands trembled violently on the desk. He looked frantically at Hale, seeking a lifeline. But the corporate attorney was already packing his briefcase with frantic, panicked speed, desperately trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. You tried to sense me, Maya said softly, though the acoustics of the breathless room carried her voice perfectly, because you thought a black woman standing alone in your courtroom was easy prey. You thought you were the law, but the law requires truth, Victor, and the truth is, you're a thief in a silk robe. The doors to the backs of the courtroom suddenly swung open. Two men in dark, unwrinkled suits stepped through the heavy oak frame. They wore earpieces and their badges clipped to their belts caught the dull fluorescent light. Federal agents. The morning delivery had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Langford saw them, and the last shred of his arrogant posture dissolved. He buried his face in his trembling hands. The gavel, once his weapon of oppression, sat abandoned and useless on the block. Maya Thompson stood tall, smoothing her jacket, watching as the system she had just detonated began to consume its most corrupt operator. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 302 did not simply swing open. They were pushed wide with the undeniable synchronized force of federal authority. The two men who strode down the center aisle moved with a calculated, predatory grace that instantly commanded the suffocating room. They bypassed the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. Ignoring the frantic whispers of the spectators, the lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, held up a leather wallet containing a gold shield. Special Agent Donovan Pierce, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Task Force, he announced, his voice a deep baritone that easily overpowered the frantic rattling of the broken air conditioning unit. Beside him stood Special Agent Claire Donovan, whose eyes were already sweeping the room, assessing threats and securing the perimeter. Judge Victor Langford remained frozen in his high-backed leather chair. The color had completely abandoned his face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent pallor. The gavel, his weapon of absolute unchecked power just seconds prior, lay discarded on the mahogany block like a forgotten toy. "What is the meaning of this?" Langford croaked, desperately trying to summon the booming patrician authority that had defined his career. His voice cracked high and thin, betraying the sheer terror vibrating through his bones. "I am in the middle of a proceeding. You have no jurisdiction to interrupt my courtroom. I am the presiding judge of the Cook County Circuit." "Not anymore, Victor," Agent Pierce replied coolly, stepping up to the edge of the bench. He did not say, Your Honor. The omission of the title echoed through the room like a physical blow. Pierce reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded piece of heavy stock paper. I have in my hand a federal arrest warrant signed recently by a United States magistrate judge. Victor Robert Langford, you are hereby placed under arrest for violations of Title 18 United States Code, Sections 1343, 1956, and 1962, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. Several people stood up, craning their necks to witness the impossible. The untouchable king of civil court was being dethroned in real time. This is an outrage, Langford shouted, slamming his trembling palms against the desk, though he lacked the strength to stand. This is a coordinated smear campaign. You are acting on the fabricated delusions of a disgruntled pro se litigant. I demand to speak to the special agent in charge. I demand to speak to the chief judge. Agent Donovan moved fluidly around the side of the bench, bypassing Deputy Holt, who had completely retreated against the wall, his hands raised in a gesture of passive surrender. Donovan ascended the 3 short wooden steps to the elevated platform. Stand up, Mr. Langford, Donovan ordered, her voice devoid of any emotion. You cannot touch me. I have absolute judicial immunity, Langford spat, spit flying from his lips as his eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an exit, a savior, anything. I will have both of your badges for this. I will see you federally indicted for obstruction of justice. Judicial immunity protects you from civil liability for your rulings, Mr. Langford, Agent Pierce corrected, stepping closer to the bench. It does not protect you from running a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate out of your chambers. Now you can stand up and walk out of here like a man, or Agent Donovan can drag you out by your collar. The choice is yours, but you are leaving this room in handcuffs. At the defendant's table, Maya Thompson stood in absolute unwavering stillness. Her posture was straight, her expression an impenetrable mask of calm satisfaction. She watched as the man who had ordered her to be silenced, who had threatened to strip her of her freedom and her family's legacy, completely unraveled. Across the aisle, the corporate shark, Attorney Preston Hale, was experiencing a profound crisis of self-preservation. Realizing the apocalyptic nature of the situation, Hale had quietly snapped his briefcase shut. He took a slow, agonizing step backward, aiming for the side exit usually reserved for court personnel. He wanted to vanish, to become a ghost, to pretend he had never heard the name Apex Holdings. "Hold it right there, counselor," Agent Pierce barked, without even turning his head, his peripheral vision catching Hale's stealthy retreat. Hale froze, his face a mask of pure terror. "Agent Pierce, I assure you, I am strictly outside counsel. I was retained by Apex Holdings for the sole purpose of standard eviction proceedings. I have absolutely no knowledge of the underlying corporate structure or any alleged offshore accounts. Attorney-client privilege dictates—" "Save it for the proper session, Richard," Pierce interrupted, finally turning to look at the sweating lawyer. "We already have agents serving a no-knock warrant at your law firm. We're seizing your servers, your hard drives, and your physical files. If you want to play the victim, you'll have to do it in an interrogation room. Otherwise, I suggest you sit down and keep your mouth shut." Hale collapsed into his chair as if his spine had dissolved. He immediately began muttering to himself, his mind frantically calculating how quickly he could draft an immunity agreement in exchange for throwing the judge to the wolves. Up on the bench, Agent Donovan had lost her patience. She reached out, grabbing Langford by the shoulder of his black silk robe, and hauled him to his feet. Langford stumbled forward, his knees buckling under his own weight. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Donovan commanded, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. No, please," Langford whimpered, the last vestiges of his arrogance crumbling into pathetic dust. "Let me make a phone call. Let me call my wife. Let me call my attorney." "You'll get your call in lockup," Donovan said. She grabbed his wrists, forcefully pulling them behind his back. The distinct metallic click-click of the ratcheting handcuffs echoed loudly over the silent gallery. It was the sound of a dynasty ending. Donovan grabbed the lapels of Langford's black judicial robe. With a swift, practiced motion, she pulled the garment down his arm, stripping it from his body. The robe fell to the floor in a crumpled heap, leaving Langford standing there in a sweat-stained dress shirt and suspenders. Stripped of his uniform, he no longer looked like a terrifying arbiter of fate. He just looked like an old, frightened, and profoundly guilty man. Agent Pierce looked past the defeated judge and locked eyes with Maya. For a brief second, the hardened federal agent offered a small, respectful nod. Maya did not smile, but she nodded back. She reached down, methodically closed her massive 3-ring binder, and held it tightly against her chest. "Let's go," Pierce said, taking Langford by the arm. As the agents paraded Victor Langford down the center aisle of Courtroom 302, the gallery erupted. There were no cheers, only a stunned electric murmuring. Several people held up their cell phones, recording the unprecedented sight of a sitting judge being perp-walked out of his own domain. Langford kept his head bowed, his chin pressed tightly against his chest, desperately trying to hide his face from the lenses. The karma he had accumulated over years of ruining lives had finally come to collect, and the interest rate was devastating. By noon, the story had violently fractured the local news cycle and was rapidly bleeding into national syndication. "Sitting Chicago judge arrested on bench in shocking federal raid," blared the banner on CNN. Local news helicopters circled the Cook County Courthouse while a small army of reporters camped outside the Dirksen Federal Building, shouting questions at anyone in a suit who walked through the revolving doors. Inside a windowless, soundproof interrogation room on the 12th floor of the FBI field office, the air was frigid. Victor Langford sat alone at a stainless steel table, his hands still cuffed, anchored to a heavy metal ring bolted to the tabletop. His expensive silk tie had been confiscated, leaving his collar undone. The sweat on his forehead had dried, leaving a cold, sticky film over his pale skin. He stared at the blank gray wall in front of him, his mind racing through a panicked Rolodex of potential saviors. He had powerful friends. He had spent years greasing the wheels of local politics, burying zoning disputes for wealthy aldermen and fast-tracking permits for billion-dollar development firms. They owed him. They could not afford to let him sink, because if he drowned, he would pull them down into the abyss with him. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. Agent Pierce walked in, carrying a manila folder and a digital audio recorder. He set the recorder on the table, pressed a red button, and stated the date, time, and the names of those present for the record. "Mr. Langford," Pierce said, sitting across from the disgraced judge. "Your attorney, Mr. Marcus Thornton, called. He said he's stuck in a media circus outside and will be here in an hour. In the meantime, I have a request from you regarding a phone call." "I need to call Appellate Judge Theodore Langston," Langford said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Arthur will clear this up. He understands the complexities of these real estate trusts. This is a massive misunderstanding, a clerical error, compounded by a hysterical woman's amateur accounting." Pierce did not smile. He opened the manila folder and slid a high-resolution color-printed document across the steel table. Langford looked down. It was a wire transfer receipt from First Atlantic Bank in the Cayman Islands. The account name was the Langford Family Heritage Trust. The amount was $450,000. The memo line required by international banking laws for large transfers read, "Apex Disbursement, 412 East 63rd Street Liquidation." Langford felt a sharp pain in his chest. That was a property he had ruled on years earlier, a foreclosure he had expedited against a widowed schoolteacher. "That's not a clerical error, Victor," Pierce said softly. "That's a digital fingerprint. And it's one of 47 identical transfers we found in the binder Miss Thompson provided. She didn't just give us the routing numbers, she gave us the SWIFT codes, the intermediary banking paths, and the shell company formation document signed by your brother-in-law in Delaware, Theodore Langston." Langford started, his voice cracking. "Theodore Langston isn't going to take your call," Pierce interrupted smoothly. "In fact, Theodore Langston just issued a press statement condemning your actions and calling for a full, independent audit of every civil case you've presided over in the previous decade. You are radioactive, Victor. Your friends aren't coming to save you. They are actively pouring concrete over your political grave to ensure they don't catch the fallout." Langford slumped forward, the chain of his handcuffs rattling against the table. The illusion of his invincibility was totally shattered. He was a man who had built his entire life on the foundation of a rigged system, and suddenly the system had turned on him. 3 floors below, in a much more comfortable sunlit conference room, Maya Thompson sat across from a forensic accountant employed by the Department of Justice. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. Her massive 3-ring binder lay open on the table, its pages marked with dozens of neon-colored sticky notes. "Miss Thompson, I've been doing this for 15 years, the DOJ accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Vargas, said, shaking her head in disbelief. "The layering techniques they use to hide the Apex Holdings ownership? This is cartel-level money laundering. They used nested LLCs, nominee directors, and staggered offshore trusts. How did a junior financial analyst at a mid-tier logistics firm unravel this?" Maya finally took a sip of her coffee. She felt an exhausted, bone-deep satisfaction settling into her muscles. "They made a mistake that arrogant people always make," Maya explained, her voice steady and analytical. "They assumed nobody was looking. When Apex filed the lien against my grandfather's house, I pulled their corporate registration. It led to a registered agent in Delaware. Standard dead end. But they paid their annual franchise tax using a corporate credit card. I found a municipal ledger in a public database that recorded the last 4 digits of that card and the issuing bank." Vargas leaned in, fascinated. "You traced a credit card?" "No, I traced the debt," Maya corrected. "I ran a cross-reference algorithm on public court filings in Cook County for the previous several years, looking for any entity represented by Preston Hale that also banked with that specific institution. I found 12 companies, all shell corporations, all engaging in aggressive property seizures, all having their cases assigned to Judge Langford." Maya flipped a page in her binder, pointing to a complex flow chart she had drawn by hand. Langford wasn't randomly assigned these cases. The clerk of the court's automated assignment system was bypassed. I requested the IT logs via the Freedom of Information Act. They showed manual overrides on every single Apex Holdings case. Langford was handpicking his own shell company's lawsuits to ensure he was the presiding judge. "My God," Vargas whispered. "He was the plaintiff, the judge, and the executioner." "Exactly," Maya said. Her eyes darkened as she remembered her grandfather, a proud man who had worked the steel mills for 40 years to buy that brownstone, reduced to tears in his final days because a fake letter claimed he was losing his home. "He thought he could just stamp a piece of paper and erase my family's history. He thought the law was his personal weapon." Vargas looked at the flowchart, her brow furrowing. She traced a line with her pen. "Miss Thompson, your analysis here accounts for about $4 million funneled into Langford's Cayman Trust." "Yes, we seized Attorney Hale's hard drives an hour ago," Vargas said, her voice dropping to a confidential hush. Hale cracked before he even got into the interrogation room. He's singing like a canary to secure a plea deal. He handed over the master ledger for the entire Vanguard Capital operation. Maya leaned forward. "And your math is flawless, Miss Thompson, but your scope was limited," Vargas revealed, tapping the table. Apex Holdings was just one tentacle. They had shell companies operating in Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. Langford wasn't acting alone. He was the primary judicial anchor for a multi-state real estate theft ring. "The total stolen equity isn't $4 million. Vargas paused, letting the weight of the revelation hang in the air. "It's north of $30 million. And according to Hale's ledger, there is a secondary offshore trust, a massive holding account that we can't locate. Hale only knows it exists. He doesn't have the routing numbers. Langford is the only one who controls the primary encryption keys to that money." Maya looked down at her binder, the numbers, the endless rows of data she had stared at until her eyes burned. Something clicked. A discrepancy she had noticed weeks earlier but had dismissed as a rounding error in a subsidiary's tax filing. "Give me Hale's master ledger," Maya said, her eyes snapping up to meet the federal accountant's gaze. The fire that had burned Judge Langford to the ground reignited. "And get me a whiteboard. He didn't hide the rest of the money in the Cayman Islands. He hid it somewhere much closer." The whiteboard in the DOJ's makeshift command center was a chaotic web of black, red, and blue dry erase marker. Maya Thompson stood before it, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows, her eyes tracing the digital breadcrumbs left behind by attorney Preston Hale's master ledger. Special Agent Donovan Pierce and forensic accountant Elena Vargas watched in quiet awe as the junior financial analyst deconstructed a $30 million criminal enterprise with the precision of a master watchmaker. Hale's ledger is meticulous, but it's a decoy, Maya explained, tapping a cluster of red numbers at the center of the board. He wanted you to follow the money to the Cayman Islands. That $4 million we traced to the Langford Family Heritage Trust. That was just the operational slush fund, the bribes, the political donations, the luxury vacations. It's walking around money. Agent Pierce crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. Where is the rest of it, Miss Thompson? $26 million in stolen equity doesn't just evaporate, even with cartel-level layering. Maya uncapped a blue marker. It didn't evaporate, it was weaponized. She drew a hard line from the central apex holdings bubble to a new empty circle on the far right of the board. Inside the circle, she wrote LFUR. I was looking at the subsidiary tax filings, Maya continued, her voice gaining momentum. Whenever Apex Holdings seized a property, like my grandfather's brownstone, they didn't always liquidate it on the open commercial market. Open market sales leave public deeds, real estate agent commissions, and a long paper trail. Instead, they were executing quiet internal transfers via quitclaim deeds to a single entity for pennies on the dollar. What is LFUR? Vargas asked, squinting at the board. It's a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, Maya stated, turning to face the federal agents. The Langford Foundation for Urban Renewal. The room went completely still. Agent Pierce slowly dropped his arms. You're telling me he hid the stolen real estate inside a registered charity? It's more insidious than that, Maya said, her eyes flashing with a cold, righteous anger. Langford used his judicial power to evict working-class families and seize their homes. Then he transferred those homes to his own charity. But the foundation didn't sell them. They held them. And because they are a charity dedicated to urban renewal, they applied for and received massive municipal and federal block grants to rehabilitate these distressed properties. Vargas gasped, the horrifying brilliance of the scheme dawning on her. They were double-dipping. Exactly, Maya nodded sharply. They stole the houses, kept the generational equity, and then had the taxpayers pay them millions of dollars to renovate properties they had just stolen. And once the renovations were complete, the foundation rented the properties back to the displaced communities at astronomical predatory rates. The $26 million isn't in a bank account in Geneva or the Caymans. It's in brick, mortar, and federal grant money right here in Cook County. Langford is the largest invisible slumlord in the state of Illinois. Pierce reached for his secure radio, his jaw set in stone. Agent Donovan, get a team together. I want a federal freeze on all assets, properties, and bank accounts associated with the Langford Foundation for Urban Renewal. And get me a warrant for Vivian Langford. If her name is on the charity charter, she's a co-conspirator. Within the hour, the FBI mobilized. While the media was still obsessing over Judge Langford's perp walk, a convoy of black SUVs descended upon a sprawling, gated estate in the affluent suburb of Winnetka. Vivian Langford, a socialite known for her lavish fundraising galas and impeccable public image, was hosting a private tennis luncheon when the feds breached the iron gates. The optics were devastating. Federal agents in tactical gear swarmed the manicured lawns, confiscating laptops, seizing luxury vehicles, and boxing up financial records from Vivian's home office. When Agent Donovan slapped the handcuffs onto Vivian's wrists, the socialite shrieked, dropping her crystal champagne flute onto the imported Italian marble patio. The illusion of the Langford dynasty's philanthropic grace was completely, violently shattered. The charity that had won them awards, political favors, and glowing profiles in high society magazines was exposed as a parasitic machine feeding on the misery of the vulnerable. And it had all been undone by a black woman with a 3-ring binder who refused to be silenced. Days later, the crushing reality of the federal justice system had fully consumed Victor Langford. He sat on a paper-thin mattress inside a 6 by 8 foot concrete cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago. The MCC was a towering triangular fortress of brutalist architecture designed to house federal inmates awaiting trial. There were no oak panels here, no silk robes, no deferential clerks or terrified pro se litigants. There was only the relentless echoing din of heavy steel doors, shouting guards, and the suffocating smell of bleach and despair. Langford wore a shapeless, scratchy orange jumpsuit. The patrician silver hair that he usually kept impeccably styled was matted and greasy. His hands shook constantly, a physical manifestation of his psychological collapse. A heavy deadbolt clacked loudly, and the steel door to his cell slid open. A corrections officer, a burly man named Officer Davis, stood in the threshold. "Langford, get up. Attorney visit," Davis barked. He did not use the title judge. In the MCC, Langford was just inmate number 8492024. Langford dragged himself off the cot and was heavily shackled, hands chained to his waist, ankles chained together. He was forced to do the jailhouse shuffle down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor, surrounded by the jeers and taunts of other inmates. Many of the men in this facility were here because of warrants signed by Langford himself. The irony was a jagged pill he was forced to swallow with every agonizing step. In the sterile glass-partitioned visitors' room, Langford sat awkwardly on a metal stool, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. On the other side of the reinforced glass sat his defense attorney, Marcus Thornton. Thornton looked exhausted, his expensive suit wrinkled, his expression grim. "Howard," Langford rasped into the phone, his voice laced with frantic desperation. "You have to get me out of here. The food is inedible. The noise, I haven't slept in days. File an emergency motion for bail. Tell Judge Langston I will surrender my passport. Tell him I'll wear a monitor." Thornton sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Victor, Judge Langston recused himself. In fact, the entire Cook County bench has requested that an out-of-state federal judge be brought in to handle your arraignment. Nobody wants to touch you. You are a political and judicial leper." Langford pressed his forehead against the cold glass. "Then use the foundation money. Liquidate the real estate portfolio. Put up whatever they want for collateral. 5 million, 10 million, just get me out." "I can't do that, Victor," Thornton said softly. Langford's head snapped up. "What do you mean you can't? I am the primary trustee." "Not anymore," Thornton replied, delivering the fatal blow. "The DOJ seized the foundation's assets yesterday. All of them. Furthermore, Vivian retained her own counsel, a ruthless federal defender named Sarah Hughes." Langford felt the blood drain from his face. "Vivian, why would she need separate counsel?" "Because she threw you under the bus, Victor," Thornton stated bluntly, abandoning all pretense of gentleness. When the FBI raided the Winnetka estate, they found a secondary ledger Vivian was keeping. She documented every single transfer you made from the Apex foreclosures to the charity. She handed it over to the U.S. Attorney's Office in exchange for full federal immunity. She's filing for divorce, and she is scheduled to be the prosecution's star witness at your trial. Langford dropped the phone. It dangled by its armored cord, swaying slightly against the glass. He could not breathe. The walls of the tiny visitation cubicle seemed to be rushing in to crush him. The ultimate betrayal had not come from the justice system, but from his own wife. Vivian, who had happily spent the millions he stole, had cut him loose the second the ship began to sink. Thornton picked his receiver back up, his voice filtering tinily through the hanging phone on Langford's side. "It gets worse. Hale signed his plea agreement this morning. He gave them the entire corporate structure of Vanguard Capital. The assistant U.S. attorney, Caleb Thorne, is convening a federal grand jury tomorrow. They are looking at 47 counts of wire fraud, 20 counts of money laundering, civil rights violations under color of law, and a RICO charge." Langford slowly picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "A RICO charge? That's for the mafia." "You ran a criminal syndicate using a gavel instead of a gun, Victor," Thornton said, packing his briefcase. "Thorne is asking for life in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole, And given the political pressure and the media circus, the judge is going to give it to him. I advise you to start preparing yourself for a guilty plea. It's the only way you avoid dying in a maximum security facility. Thornton hung up the phone and walked away, leaving Langford utterly alone. As the guards shackled him to lead him back to his cell, Langford caught a glimpse of his reflection in the reinforced glass. He did not see a powerful jurist. He did not see an untouchable king of the courtroom. He saw a broken, pathetic old man who had finally been swallowed by the monstrous machine he had spent his life operating. The karma was absolute. For years, he had ruthlessly stripped families of their homes, their dignity, and their futures, dismissing their pleas with a bang of his wooden gavel. Now stripped of his own home, his wealth, his family, and his freedom, he was locked in a concrete cage, silenced by the very system he had corrupted. And the woman who had turned the key was the very same black woman he had arrogantly ordered the bailiff to gag. Maya Thompson had not just won her case, she had rewritten the law of consequences. More than a year later, the atmosphere inside Courtroom 254 of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse buzzed with a vindictive, electric anticipation. Every mahogany bench was packed to capacity with reporters and the very victims displaced by the Langford Foundation for Urban Renewal, all waiting for the final curtain to fall on Illinois' most catastrophic judicial corruption scandal. In the second row of the public gallery sat Maya Thompson wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. She did not have her massive 3-ring binder. Today she did not need it. The heavy lifting was done. Today was solely about witnessing the harvest of the seeds Victor Langford had so arrogantly sown. A heavy side door opened. Victor Langford was escorted in by 2 armed federal marshals. His physical transformation drew a synchronized gasp from the gallery. More than a year in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, denied bail as a flight risk, had stripped away his patrician grandeur. He was gaunt and hollow-eyed, and his drab olive-green federal inmate jumpsuit hung off his shrinking frame. The heavy chains around his waist and ankles clanked loudly in the cavernous room, a grim, rhythmic replacement for the strike of his wooden gavel. He collapsed into his chair next to his exhausted attorney, Marcus Thornton, refusing to look at the gallery. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed. Judge William Barrett, a strict, no-nonsense federal judge flown in from New York to ensure absolute impartiality, took his seat at the elevated bench. He looked down at Langford with cold, piercing disgust. "We are here for the sentencing phase in the matter of the United States versus Victor Robert Langford," Judge Barrett commanded. "The defendant has pled guilty to 1 count of RICO violations, 15 counts of wire fraud, and 10 counts of money laundering. Mr. Thorne, is the government prepared?" Assistant U.S. Attorney Caleb Thorne stood. "Your Honor, Victor Langford weaponized the sacred trust of the judiciary to orchestrate the eviction of 142 families. He hid these stolen properties behind the grotesque facade of a charitable foundation, enriching himself with taxpayer-funded grants meant to help the communities he was destroying. Thanks to the extraordinary courage of a private citizen, Miss Maya Thompson, this syndicate was dismantled. We have secured $28 million in a restitution fund for the victims. The defendant's estate is gone. His pension is revoked. He stands before you with nothing but the consequences of his greed." Marcus Thornton stood, weary and defensive. "Your Honor, Mr. Langford is 68. He has suffered severe physical and mental decline during pre-trial detention. We ask for a downward departure to 10 years in a medical facility. A harsher sentence is effectively a death sentence." Judge Barrett silenced the murmurs of outrage in the gallery. "The court will hear the victim impact statement. The government calls Maya Thompson." Langford flinched. As Maya walked down the center aisle, crossing into the well of the court, the profound poetic symmetry settled over the room. More than a year earlier, he had sat high above her, screaming for his bailiffs to gag her. Today, Maya stepped up to the federal podium, a free woman, while Langford sat below her in chains, entirely at the mercy of the system he had desecrated. "Look at me, Victor," Maya said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet, terrifying authority. Langford kept his head down, trembling violently. "I said, look at me," Maya commanded. Slowly, Agonizingly, Langford raised his head. His hollow eyes met hers, filled with suffocating terror. "You told me I was out of my depth," Maya said, refusing to let him look away. "You banged your gavel and ordered a man with a gun to silence me. You thought because I was a black woman fighting for my grandfather's house, I was invisible. You thought I was just a number on a ledger you could easily erase." She took a slow, deep breath. "But ledgers always balance in the end. You built an empire on the suffering of people you considered beneath your notice. You stole my grandfather's peace in his final days. You stole from single mothers and veterans who trusted the law. You used justice as a smokescreen for theft. The defense asks for mercy because you are aging. But you showed no mercy to the elderly people you threw onto the streets in the dead of winter. True justice requires the punishment to reflect the exact depth of the cruelty inflicted." She looked down at the broken man in the green jumpsuit. "You tried to take my voice, Victor, but all you did was give me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy your life. I want you to spend the rest of your days in a concrete box, listening to the echoes of the lives you ruined. We are still here. We have our homes back, and you have absolutely nothing." Maya returned to her seat in absolute silence. The devastating execution of karma hung heavy in the air. Judge Barrett adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Langford, please stand." Langford struggled to rise, his chained ankles scraping harshly against the floor. "Victor Robert Langford," Judge Barrett began, his voice ringing like a death knell, "you did not just break the law. You wore it as a disguise while you robbed the vulnerable blind. You are a disgrace to the legal profession and a textbook sociopath. I completely reject the request for leniency. Your age does not insulate you from the devastation you caused." Barrett picked up a heavy stack of documents. "On the count of racketeering, I sentence you to 240 months. For wire fraud and money laundering, an additional 120 months to be served consecutively. You are remanded to the Federal Bureau of Prisons for 30 years without the possibility of parole. I also signed the final order of forfeiture, permanently stripping you of all remaining assets." Judge Barrett raised his wooden gavel. "May God have mercy on your soul, Mr. Langford, because the United States justice system has none left for you." Crack! The strike of the gavel was deafening, the absolute end of Langford's existence. He collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably as federal marshals dragged him away to his dark, inescapable reality. Maya Thompson stood up, buttoned her jacket, and walked out into the warm Chicago sunlight, leaving the ruins of the Langford Empire permanently behind her. In the end, the courtroom, once Victor Langford's personal theater of systemic oppression, became the very stage of his spectacular undoing. Maya Thompson did not merely save her grandfather's estate. She dismantled a predatory criminal empire built entirely on the backs of vulnerable citizens. Langford, stripped of his black robes, his ill-gotten millions, and his false dignity, learned the agonizing reality that true power resides not in a wooden gavel, but in the unyielding force of documented truth. Karma, swift and uncompromising, exacted its ultimate toll, leaving a disgraced man to rot behind the cold iron bars he had so ruthlessly assigned to others. Maya's courage proved that no one is truly untouchable, and that an attempt to silence the marginalized, when met with bravery, becomes the exact catalyst for a shattering, undeniable justice.